Keeping food fresh today is something you outsource to a humming white box in your kitchen. You buy more than you need, you drive it home, and you shove it into a machine that holds back the entire process of decay using electricity and a mild sense of guilt about the vegetables in the bottom drawer. If something looks questionable, you sniff it, make a face, and throw it out, secure in the knowledge that more food is a short trip away. The most dramatic food crisis in a modern home is discovering the milk turned the morning you wanted cereal. But for ancient humans, food going bad was not an inconvenience, it was a countdown. A successful hunt could bring in hundreds of pounds of meat, more than a group could possibly eat before it began to rot, which meant the very best day of the season was quietly attached to a deadline. A good harvest had to somehow last through a winter when nothing grew. Fish caught in a single abundant run had to feed people through months when the water gave up nothing. Food did not politely wait. The moment it was gathered, an invisible army of bacteria, mold, and insects began racing the humans for the same calories. And that army never took a day off. So what did people actually do before refrigeration, before canning, before a single label with an expiration date? Did they simply eat everything as fast as possible and starve later? Did they let things rot and get sick? Or did they figure out, thousands of years before anyone knew a microbe existed, how to reach into food and switch off decay? The answer is that ancient humans became astonishingly good at this, so good that some of their preserved food is still edible today. And in learning to keep food fresh, they were not just avoiding hunger. They were building the foundations of trade, settlement, wealth, and civilization itself. The refrigerator is new. The war it fights is very, very old. Before keeping food fresh could become a defining human skill, our ancestors first had to create the problem. That sounds strange because we think of spoilage as just a fact of nature, but most animals never face a preservation crisis because most animals only ever have exactly as much food as they can eat right now. A predator makes a kill, eats until full, and leaves the rest to the flies and scavengers. There is no storage plan. There is no next week. The food that is not eaten is simply lost, and the animal goes hunting again when it is hungry. Humans broke that pattern. We started doing something that in the animal world is genuinely unusual. We began producing more than we could immediately consume and then trying to keep it. Cooperative hunting could bring down animals far larger than any single person needed. Fishing during a seasonal run could pull in a staggering haul in a few days, and eventually farming produced grain by the sack, harvested all at once in a burst of plenty that had to somehow stretch across a barren season. Each of these advances was a triumph. Each one also created a brand new enemy, because a pile of surplus food is not a safe cushion against hunger. Left alone, it is a time bomb. And the reason is life itself. Just life too small to see. Fresh food is dense with water and nutrients, which makes it an irresistible feast not only for humans but for bacteria, molds, and yeasts, and for the insects and animals that follow them. These organisms move fast. In warm, damp conditions, meat can turn dangerous within a day, and the process is not always visible until it is too late. Ancient people did not know that microscopic organisms existed. What they knew was the result: the smell, the slime, the color, the sickness, and sometimes the death that followed eating something that had gone wrong. They were fighting an enemy they could not see, could not name, and could not fully understand. And somehow, through generations of trial error and remembering who got sick and who did not, they learned to win. The first great weapon in that war was almost breathtakingly simple: take the water out. Bacteria and molds need moisture to grow, so if food dried thoroughly enough becomes a place where almost nothing can live. Humans figured this out extremely early. There is evidence that people in the Middle East and Asia were deliberately drying foods in the sun and wind as far back as around 12,000 years ago, which makes drying one of the oldest preservation techniques we know of. Strips of meat and fish, laid out in the sun or hung in the wind, would slowly harden into something that could last for months. It was not glamorous. It did not taste like a fresh meal. But dried food did not rot, and food that did not rot was, in a very real sense, survival you could carry with you. Smoke made drying better. At some point, likely not long after humans learned to control fire, someone noticed that meat hung above a fire lasted longer than meat left out, and lasted longer still than meat merely dried. This was not a coincidence they could explain, but it worked. Smoke dries the surface of food and coats it in compounds that slow the growth of the very microbes and insects trying to move in. A fire built for warmth and light doubled as a preservation station, and the smoky flavor was a bonus that humans, then as now, decided they rather liked. Then came salt, and salt changed everything. Salt pulls water out of food and out of the microbes trying to grow in it, drying them from the inside in a way that plain air cannot match. Early cultures in places like ancient Mesopotamia, sitting near natural salt deposits, discovered that this ordinary mineral was also a preservation weapon of extraordinary power. Meat and fish packed in salt could last not for days, but for months or longer. Salt was so valuable, so central to keeping people fed through lean times, that it became one of the most important trade goods in the ancient world, worth carrying across enormous distances. The word salary itself traces back to salt. A mineral you now spill without a second thought was once quite literally a form of wealth, because it was a form of survival. And then there is the strangest weapon of all, the one that sounds like it should cause spoilage rather than prevent it: fermentation. Instead of killing every microbe, fermentation recruits helpful ones and lets them take over, producing acids and alcohol that make the food hostile to the dangerous organisms. The result is transformed and preserved at the same time. Humans have been doing this for a very long time. Evidence for fermentation as preservation reaches back around 10,000 years, with fermented beverages documented by roughly 7,000 years before the Common Era. Every time you eat cheese, yogurt, pickles, or sauerkraut, or drink beer or wine, you are tasting a technology that ancient people used to make milk, vegetables, and grain last far beyond their natural life. They did not understand the chemistry. They understood that if you did it right, the food kept, and if you did it wrong, you found out. The evidence that these methods worked is not just theoretical. In some cases, we can still eat the results. Consider honey. Honey is one of the only foods on Earth that essentially never spoils, thanks to its very low water content, its acidity, and a mild antiseptic chemistry created by enzymes the bees add. When Howard Carter opened the tomb of Tutankhamun sealed for over 3,000 years, there were jars of honey among the provisions, and honey found in ancient Egyptian tombs has been reported still edible after all that time. The Egyptians did not need to know the science. They knew honey lasted, they treasured it, and they packed it for a journey they believed would last forever. Or consider the extraordinary case of bog butter. Across Ireland and Britain, people for thousands of years buried butter and animal fat packed in wooden containers deep in peat bogs. A bog is cold, acidic, and low in oxygen, which makes it a nearly perfect natural refrigerator. The oldest known example, found in a bog in County Offaly, Ireland, is estimated at around 5,000 years old, and the tradition of bog butter stretched across at least 3,500 years. Lumps of it are still being pulled out of the ground today, waxy and, remarkably, sometimes still technically edible, though nobody is exactly lining up to spread it on toast. Whether it was buried purely to preserve it, to protect it from thieves, or as an offering to the gods, the point stands: people understood that the right environment could hold back decay for lifetimes. Then there is pemmican, one of the most sophisticated preserved foods ever invented, developed by indigenous peoples of North America. It combines two preservation ideas into one. Meat is dried until almost no water remains, then pounded into a powder and mixed with rendered fat, and sometimes dried berries. The dryness stops microbes from growing, and the fat seals the whole thing away from air. The result is a dense, energy-rich food that can last for years without spoiling, portable enough to carry across vast distances. It was survival, nutrition, and logistics compressed into a single block. And it was so effective that later explorers and traders adopted it wholesale. Humans also learned to fight decay with cold, even in places with no natural ice on hand. In ancient China, ice houses were being used to store winter ice into the warm months as far back as the 8th century before the Common Era, cutting and storing ice so that cold could be summoned out of season. In the deserts of Persia, engineers built structures called yakhchals, ice pits, great insulated mud brick domes that could store ice and preserved food through blistering summers, using clever design and the way heat radiates away into clear night skies to make and keep ice in a climate that seems to forbid it. These were, in effect, refrigerators built entirely out of architecture and knowledge, running on no power at all, accept the physics of the environment. Here is the honest part, though. The tidy list of clever methods tends to skip. Most food and most of the containers and structures that held it simply do not survive across deep time. Fresh food rots by definition, which is the whole problem, so the act of preserving it usually leaves no direct trace. A wooden drying rack decays, a pit lined with grass collapses and fills in. A method passed from parent to child by demonstration leaves no written recipe for thousands of years. So when we talk about the earliest preservation, we are often reasoning from indirect clues. Residue inside a broken pot, the chemistry of ancient containers, the design of a storage pit, and the practices of more recent peoples rather than from a preserved Stone Age meal we can point to and date. That means we should be careful about which parts of the story are solid and which are educated guesses. We can be very confident that drying, smoking, salting, and fermentation are ancient because the evidence for them is broad and deep. We can be confident honey and bog butter last because we have literally held the results. But some of the famous dates are shakier than they sound. The oft-repeated claim that Persian yak chowls go back to 400 years before the Common Era, for instance, is not always backed by firm archaeological evidence, and many surviving structures are far more recent. The deep past rewards a little humility. The broad strokes are certain. The precise first date of any given trick usually is not. We should also resist the cartoon of ancient people as helpless victims of rot, gnawing desperately at spoiled food and hoping for the best. The reality is closer to the opposite. These were expert food scientists working without the science, running a sophisticated operation with drying, smoking, salting, souring, sealing, burying, and chilling, matched carefully to their climate and their food. They knew which method suited fish and which suited grain. They knew the seasons, the timing, the containers, the risks. They were not fumbling. They were managing. Because keeping food fresh was never really just about not getting sick. It was about power over time, and that changed everything. The moment you can store food, you can survive the season when there is none, which means you can stay in one place instead of endlessly chasing the next meal. Storage made settlements possible, and settlements made villages, and villages made cities. Preserved surplus meant some people no longer had to spend every hour finding food, which freed hands for building, crafting, trading, and everything we call culture. A community with full storage pits had security, and security is the soil that civilization grows in. Preservation also created wealth, and with it, inequality and ambition. Stored grain was a form of savings, and whoever controlled the granary held real power. Salt became a currency worth fighting over and taxing. Preserved food could be carried, which meant it could be traded across distances, connecting distant peoples through the simple fact that a dried, salted, or fermented good could survive the journey. Armies marched on preserved rations. Long voyages of exploration were only possible because food could be made to last at sea. Every one of those human enterprises rested quietly on the ability to reach into food and pause its decay, and it wove itself into meaning too. The harvest stored for winter, the feast made possible by months of careful preservation, the honey packed for the afterlife, the butter offered to the bog. These were not just practical acts. They were tied to ritual, to celebration, to belief, to the deep human relationship with abundance and scarcity. Food that lasted was food you could give, share, save, and build a future around. Preservation was survival, but it was also hope made physical, plenty held in reserve against the certainty of lean days ahead. Today, all of that fits behind a door you open without thinking. You reach into a cold box lit by a little light, take out food kept fresh by a machine you never have to understand, and you close it again. You can waste food casually, because scarcity feels like an abstraction. The great war against decay that once defined the calendar, the timing of the hunt, the labor of an entire community, has been quietly won on your behalf and hidden inside an appliance that mostly just hums. But peel away the electricity and the design, and what your refrigerator does is exactly what your ancestors did. It takes the enemy of moisture, warmth, and time and holds it back so that today's abundance can feed a hungrier tomorrow. Every time you dry herbs, salt something, pickle a jar of vegetables, freeze leftovers, or simply trust that the food will still be good in the morning, you are using ancient knowledge, refined over 10,000 years, of people who could not see their enemy and beat it anyway. So the next time you stand in front of an open fridge, staring into the cold and deciding you are not actually hungry, remember what that convenience really is. It is the end point of one of humanity's longest and most important struggles, the fight to make good times last into the bad ones. Ancient humans waged that fight with sun, smoke, salt, sour ice, and buried butter, and they won it well enough to build the world we inherited. The refrigerator did not start that story. It just finished a chapter. Admittedly, with a light that turns on when you open the door.